Hello, everybody. I'm Don Arleth, and welcome for a round of World Talks here on TVP World. President Trump has started the trade war, first with Canada, Mexico, and China, but the EU seems to be next in the crosshairs of the new American president. So what impact could it have if tariffs are imposed here in the EU, especially here in Central Europe? To discuss, I'm now joined by Professor Iain Begg from the London School of Economics. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us today on World Talks.
Good evening.
Now, concerning these, the notion that Donald Trump wants to put tariffs on the European Union, he says that the EU doesn't take American automobiles, it doesn't take American agricultural products. To look and see, it is true that tariffs are 4 times higher on American cars than on European cars in America. And there are certain agricultural products that have very, very hefty taxes levied against them here in Europe. So with that in mind, everything that we're hearing from European leaders are that this is going to spell economic doom between the two countries. Should this be the focal point, or should European leaders maybe figure out how to fix the trade imbalances that Trump seems to be alluding to?
Well, the first thing to say is that Trump seems to be obsessed with the idea that the trade balance with every single country is what you should be looking at. That's false, because there's give and take in the world trading system. Poland or the United Kingdom might export more to one country and import more from another, and it tends to net out. It's the American consumer who decides what they're buying. And if the American consumer chooses Polish food products and British automobiles, then it shouldn't be a surprise that you tend to get imbalances in these particular sectors. Instead, what we should be looking at is the impact both on consumers, on tax takes, and on the likely reorientation of trade that would occur as a result of American tariffs and retaliation by those he hits. We've seen it already with Canada. We'd be very likely to see it with the EU as well. In short, if tariffs are imposed, consumers tend to pay more because a tax on what they're importing, and unless the exporter decides to absorb that, which in most cases they won't be able to with 25% tariffs, it's going to increase the price in the markets in which these tariffs are imposed. It can be an advantage for the public finances of the country imposing the tariffs, and that's one thing that Trump seems to be banking on. However, what it also does is to reorientate trade. If you are thwarted in trying to sell to the US, you try harder to sell somewhere else where there's a more open market. So there's nuance in all this rather than very straightforward calculations.
Well, and Donald Trump also says that he wants to kind of boost domestic manufacturing, which has disappeared over the last 3 decades. Most of it's been absorbed in China, but also in Mexico and Canada. Of course, we saw what Trump did with the free trade agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement in his first term. So the question is, by imposing tariffs, will he achieve his goals in the short term, or is this something that could take years, if not decades?
Well, he tried it in his first presidency, and it didn't seem to have much effect, according to the academic analysts I've looked at, particularly from the National Bureau of Economic Research. In theory, yes, tariffs can divert demand from foreigners to domestic producers. But many domestic producers rely on inputs, which are also imported. Take the example of American cars. They import steel. They need to import steel to make the cars, and if they impose a tariff on steel, it becomes more expensive and makes the cars more expensive. So it undercuts the initial impulse that you were trying to get. Once again, I think you have to look in detail at these things before you can make crude calculations of whether it's good or bad for American manufacturing jobs. In any case, the US these days is an exporter of different things. It's the leading economy in the world on social media. It's a leader in many financial services, and these are the things that other countries want to buy from the Americans. Whether they're going to be able ever to undercut the cheaper labor costs in other parts of the world is implausible.
Certainly. And now, concerning tariffs here in Europe, who do you think stands to lose the most? There are certain countries that have much bigger trade surpluses with the United States, and there are others that are either at zero or about even, and then there are others that actually have trade deficits. So which countries in particular are going to be affected most if Trump institutes a blanket tariffs regime?
Well, to state the obvious, countries with very large surpluses, if their exports are hit, and the particular sectors they specialize in are hit, then they're going to lose most. But it's important to recall that the EU negotiates as a bloc of 27 countries. It's a customs union, which means there is a common external tariff vis-à-vis the rest of the world. And the deals that the EU negotiates with other countries are also common to all 27 member states. So you'd have to work out or know what sectors Trump proposes to target. Could it be Polish vodka? Who knows? Could it be Scotch whiskey, which comes from a country outside the EU? Could it be French brandy? All these things would have to be taken into account to figure out who is going to win or lose from it. And I don't think there's going to be an easy answer until you know the details of Trump's plans.
With Trump instituting tariffs on so many countries, the first three that I mentioned, like Canada, Mexico, China, although he's just announced just moments ago that there's going to be a 1-month delay on those tariffs coming into force, but as well as him considering the European Union, by targeting so many countries at once, what are the possibilities that inflation in the United States is actually going to increase?
Well, it's highly likely, because if you impose a 25% tariff on things that the Americans import, at least some of that tariff will go into higher prices of those things. Maybe not all of it, because some may be absorbed by importers, some may be absorbed by exporters, but realistically they cannot absorb that scale of increase in price as a result of the tariff. So it will translate into higher inflation in the US. And also, if American consumers divert to spending their money on more expensive American goods, that too will add to inflation. So it's not an easy solution. It's maybe also worth making the point that Trump seems to be doing two quite distinct things with his tariffs. One is to punish countries, and here the Mexican case is the most obvious one, which he deems to be doing things that are against Americans' international interests, particularly the drug cartels and the immigration. He wants to say, unless you stop immigration to the US, unless you stop the drug cartels, we impose tariffs. For other parts of the world, like China, it's much more narrowly a trade decision. And I would guess that it will also be a trade decision for European countries, including the Central and Eastern European countries you mentioned.
Well, and with China, I think a lot of people are surprised why China gets away with only 10%, where America's two biggest trading partners right there on the North American continent get 25%.
In China's case, it's 10% on top of the tariffs they already have imposed, which were done in Trump 1 and by Biden. So it's not as though the Chinese have a free pass relative to the Mexicans and the Canadians.
And in terms of retaliation, and especially for the European Union, how do you see the European Union fighting back against blanket tariffs against EU goods?
Well, I'm sure that in Brussels there will already be a schedule of things that they want to impose tariffs on. In the last round with Trump, Harley-Davidson motorcycles were a case in point. And I don't know if you're a Harley-Davidson motorcyclist, but you would have found your purchase more expensive. There will be a list of things that the European authorities think are worth imposing tariffs on to cause maximum pressure on Trump to calm down. So yes, Europe will retaliate, and I'm sure they have the package of retaliation ready to go if they're faced with significant tariffs. But there'll also be some calculations saying, well, how much do we want to escalate this? If Trump says, yes, there's a new tariff on Europe of 5%, that might be sufficiently low not to cause massive retaliation. But if he goes 25 or 50% or something crazy, Europeans will retaliate.
Right, and with this budget deficit for the United States in trade with the European Union stands last year, according to statistics, most recent statistics, is around $80 billion. Now, back in 2022, it was more closer to $130 billion. Is it possible that the politicians should stay calm and try and figure out how to close this gap so that both sides are happy? So it's not a zero-sum game, but each side gives a little to try and reduce these numbers a little bit.
Well, that was always the principle behind multilateral trade deals. The World Trade Organization, which mediated those multilateral trade deals, is in total disarray because of the way the Americans have shunned the dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO. It's also worth pointing out that you shouldn't look only at goods. You also have to look at services, where major industrial economies like the US, like the United Kingdom, tend to do far better on services than they do on goods. And until you get a very clear picture of the different components of international transactions, it's it's necessary to be cautious about exactly what figures you're bandying around.
Well, with as we see with the digital services, social media, tech companies that do business here in Europe, many of them have been slapped with bigger fines than seen anywhere else in the world. People in the United States say that's an obvious tariff. The regulation fines that American companies constantly endure here in Europe.
Yes, but they're fined because they're engaging in non-competitive practices. And that's different from a tariff. It's not as though every time you indirectly pay some money to Facebook or to Twitter that you are charged as an individual. So you, the consumer, are not paying this. What the companies are being penalized for is engaging in monopoly practices which exclude other actors or other companies that want to come into the system. Now, yes, the Americans can conflate all this and say, yes, Europe is punishing us, therefore we have to punish them in a different way. But analytically, I would argue for keeping the two approaches separate. It's not as though the US authorities haven't fined European companies, and banks in particular, for some of the things that they've done. So there's a bit of quid pro quo goes on there.
Now, in terms of what this may do to the global economy and economic growth in 2025, what are your predictions?
Well, there's a famous saying that many economists use, say, other things being equal. And in this case, other things being equal, it's probably going to be negative for economic growth, not necessarily causing a recession, but slowing economic growth compared with what might have been expected.
All right. Well, hopefully there is an answer to these trade wars, and hopefully they don't spiral out of control. Professor Iain Begg from the European Institute at the London School of Economics, thank you very much, sir, for your analysis.
Thank you. Good evening.
And that concludes this round of World Talks. Thank you for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.